The doors blew open at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the men who walked through them weren't patients. They carried weapons under their jackets, moved in tight formation, and spoke to each other in clipped, coded phrases that the security guard at the front desk had no framework to process before the first blow landed. Within 40 seconds, the emergency room at Hartwell General Medical Center was no longer a hospital. It was a hostage situation. 43 patients, 11 staff members, one exit blocked. And the only person in that building who had ever faced anything like this before was standing in the supply closet on the east corridor, restocking IV bags, wearing blue scrubs with a coffee stain on the left sleeve. Her name was Donna Marsh. Everyone called her the Rookie. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. If this story has you hooked already, stick with me all the way to the end. Hit like, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had started badly, which was nothing new. Dana Marsh arrived at Hartwell General at 6:50 in the morning, 10 minutes before her shift was supposed to begin, badge already clipped to her chest, hair pulled back tight enough to give her a headache by noon. She came through the staff entrance on the north side of the building, nodded to the facilities guy mopping the corridor floor, and made her way toward the locker room without speaking to anyone. That wasn't rudeness, that was learned behavior. Speaking first, in this hospital, in this department, had a way of going badly. She'd been at Hartwell for 7 months, long enough to know the rhythms of the place, the personalities, the invisible rules that nobody wrote down but everyone enforced, long enough to understand that her position in the ER hierarchy sat somewhere below the charge nurses, well below the attending physicians, and approximately level with the equipment carts. Useful when needed, ignored otherwise. She didn't mind the work. She minded the way certain people watched her do it, like they were waiting for her to prove something they'd already decided about her. The locker room was empty when she got there. She changed, pocketed her phone, and pulled her hair back a second time because the first attempt had left it uneven. In the mirror, she looked like what she was supposed to be, a 29-year-old ER nurse on a Tuesday morning shift, unremarkable, forgettable, perfectly ordinary. She was used to looking that way. She'd practiced it. The ER at Hartwell General Medical Center occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor, a sprawling space of curtained bays, trauma rooms, a dedicated pediatric section, and a nursing station that served as the nerve center for all of it. Hartwell was a Level 1 trauma center in Corbin Falls, a mid-sized city in central Kentucky that had grown fast enough in the last decade to strain every public service it had, including its hospitals. The ER ran at or above capacity most days. Nights were worse. Dana took the morning handoff from the night nurse, a tired woman named Brenda, who gave her a rundown of the current patients in 15 words or less per case, and then grabbed her things and left without ceremony. Dana read through the charts herself, checked on each patient in sequence, updated the board, and had already put in 2 medication requests and flagged 1 patient for a reassessment before the rest of the day staff had finished their coffee. Nobody noticed. That was fine. What was not fine was Bay 7. The patient in Bay 7 was a man in his mid-50s named Gerald Poole, admitted the previous evening with chest discomfort that had been initially assessed as musculoskeletal. Dana read his chart, looked at his last set of vitals, and stood at the foot of his bed for a moment longer than she usually would. His color was off. Not dramatically, not the kind of off that triggered alarms, but the subtle graying quality around his mouth and below his eyes that she had learned through long experience in places the chart didn't know about to take seriously. She checked his pulse manually, ran through his medications, asked him 3 questions that weren't on the standard intake form, just quiet conversation, watching his eyes and his breathing while they talked. "How long has your left arm been bothering you?" she asked. Gerald Poole looked at her. "Didn't mention that." "I know. How long?" He thought about it. "Couple days, maybe 3. Figured it was from moving boxes at my daughter's place." Dana kept her face neutral. She thanked him, told him she'd be back shortly, and walked directly to the nursing station to pull up his full history. Then she went to find Dr. Marcus Aldrin. Dr. Aldrin was the ER chief at Hartwell General, and he had occupied that position for 11 years with the kind of settled authority that accumulates when no one seriously challenges you long enough. He was not incompetent. That was the frustrating part. He knew his medicine, ran a functional department, and his patient outcomes were solid. What he was, underneath the competence, was the specific variety of physician who had confused seniority with infallibility and stopped genuinely listening to people he'd already categorized as below him. Dana found him near the physician workstation reviewing something on a tablet. She waited until he looked up. "Dr. Aldrin, I have a concern about the patient in Bay 7. Gerald Poole, chest discomfort admit from last night. His vitals look okay on paper, but I'm not comfortable with his presentation. Left arm discomfort he didn't mention on intake, coloring that's Poole's been assessed." Aldrin didn't look up from the tablet. "Musculoskeletal, possible costochondritis. He's scheduled for discharge this afternoon." "I understand that's the assessment. I'm saying I think it may be worth a second look. His Marsh." He said her name the way people say words that are supposed to end conversations. Flat, declarative, final. "I've been running this department since before you graduated nursing school. If the chart says musculoskeletal, it's musculoskeletal. If you want to flag something, flag it through the proper documentation channels." He went back to his tablet. Dana stood there for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said quietly, "The proper documentation channels don't get him a 12-lead EKG in the next 20 minutes." Aldrin looked up. His expression was not anger exactly. It was the particular variety of irritation that comes from being contradicted by someone you've decided doesn't have the standing to contradict you. "Are you a cardiologist, Marsh?" "No." "Then I suggest you stay in your lane and let the physicians do their jobs. That's how this department functions. Everyone in their place doing what they're trained to do." He held her gaze for a moment, making sure the point had landed. "Understood." Dana looked at him. "Understood." She walked away from the workstation, turned left at the corridor junction, and put in an unofficial request to the charge nurse, Lorraine Vasquez, for a repeat vitals check on Poole in 20 minutes, and a note in his file flagging her concern. Lorraine was 47 years old, had been a nurse for 22 years, and had learned long ago to trust her gut about which rookie nurses were actually rookies and which ones were something else. She looked at Dana for a moment, then put in the request. 22 minutes later, Gerald Poole's blood pressure dropped, and his 12-lead EKG showed changes consistent with an evolving myocardial infarction. He was taken to the cath lab within the hour. Dr. Aldrin didn't acknowledge Dana's flag. Nobody did, formally. But Lorraine found her during a medication run and said, quietly, "Good catch." And that was enough. What it was not was the end of the problem. The weeks that followed established a pattern that Dana had navigated before, in other institutions, other departments, though never quite in these circumstances. Aldrin's attitude toward her shifted from dismissive to actively obstructive in the specific, deniable way that experienced department chiefs execute when they want someone gone but can't justify a formal complaint. Her shift assignments started getting changed at short notice. Patient loads she requested were redistributed. In 2 separate incidents, equipment she needed was either missing from supply or logged out under her name without her knowledge. She documented everything. Quietly, methodically. In a personal log she kept on an encrypted drive and did not discuss with anyone at the hospital. It wasn't the first time she'd had to do that either. The other nurses were a mixed picture. Lorraine remained a consistent, if careful, ally. A younger nurse named Petra Hollis, 2 years out of school, watched Dana with the complicated attention of someone trying to figure out which side of a fence to land on. The rest ranged from neutral to indifferent. Nobody was overtly hostile. Nobody stood up either. Dana understood the math. She was 7 months in. She hadn't established enough social capital to make standing up for her cost-effective for anyone who might otherwise be inclined. She needed more time, or she needed an event that changed the calculation. She got the event. She just hadn't accounted for what kind it would be. The shift started normally on the Tuesday. She would later measure everything before and after. She came in at 7, took her hand off, checked her patients. The ER was at 112% of capacity. Not unusual, not yet alarming. The city had been having a difficult month. A factory accident 2 weeks prior had backed things up, and the flu season was landing early and hard. By mid-morning, the board was a color palette of competing urgencies. Dana moved through her section without stopping, staying ahead of the work through the particular discipline of a person who has learned to run on very little margin for error. She caught a medication interaction in Bay 4 that she flagged to the prescribing physician. She talked a panicking teenager through a panic attack in Bay 9 without using the word panic because she'd learned that didn't help. She changed dressings, ran labs, updated charts, and ate nothing until 1 in the afternoon when she stood in the corridor outside the supply room and consumed half a granola bar in approximately 90 seconds. It was at 1:18 that the hospital's overhead system issued an alert. Not the kind of alert the ER staff was accustomed to, not a trauma activation or a code. A security alert. 2 tones, then a voice, then a message that was short and technical and generated an immediate, visible reaction in every staff member who heard it. Dana was in the supply room when it went out. She stood completely still for 3 seconds, listening to the message repeat, and felt something shift in the space behind her sternum. Not fear exactly. Something older and more specific than fear. She had heard alerts like that before. She finished pulling the IV supplies she'd come for, set them on the shelf, and stepped out into the corridor. The nurse's station was 15 feet away. Lorraine was there, one hand on the desk, the other pressing a phone to her ear. Her face had the specific quality of someone receiving information that keeps getting worse. Dana crossed the distance in measured strides and waited. Lorraine hung up and turned. Security says there are armed men in the building, north entrance and the main lobby. At least 4, maybe more. They're not responding to staff challenges. She paused. They're asking everyone to shelter in place. Dana looked at the ER. 43 patients across the bays, the waiting area, the trauma rooms. 11 staff members, 2 security officers on the floor, both positioned on the other side of the department from the threat, both almost certainly already cut off. What about the exits? Dana asked. East Corridor exit went down 12 minutes ago. Maintenance said it was a mechanical fault, but now no one's picking up down there. Dana processed this without expression. The north stairwell. Same. Both access points on that side are compromised. Lorraine was watching her with an expression that was trying to be professional and not entirely managing it. Dana, what do we do? It was the first time in 7 months that anyone at Hartwell General had asked her that question. We moved the ambulatory patients out of the primary bays and into the back corridor, Dana said. Trauma rooms 1 and 2 have the only doors that lock from the inside with any real integrity. We put anyone who can't be moved into those rooms. We consolidate. She was already thinking through the layout, the sight lines, the weight-bearing walls, the one-way access points that could be advantages or disadvantages depending on what was coming and from where. And we keep everybody quiet. Lorraine stared at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she started moving. The next 8 minutes were the kind of controlled chaos that looks, to anyone watching, like pure confusion, but is, to the people executing it, something closer to a different language. Dana moved through the department with a calm that she was not performing. She had simply slipped into a register she knew how to operate in, one she had spent years building and then years trying not to need. She helped a 60-year-old cardiac patient named Harold into the back corridor, speaking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular while she moved him, because she had learned that people under stress need the sound of calm more than they need information. She repositioned a woman with a fractured wrist, a man on oxygen, a teenager with an IV line still in place. She found Petra Hollis frozen near the pediatric bay and touched her shoulder once. Petra, I need you to take Mrs. Kaminsky and the 2 kids in Bay 12 to Trauma Room 2. Knock twice before you open the door. Don't stop moving until you're inside. Petra looked at her. Something in Dana's tone cut through whatever had locked her up. Okay, she said, and went. Dr. Aldrin appeared from the physician workstation area, and Dana could see from 20 feet away that he was operating on adrenaline and had not yet located a direction to point it. What is happening? He demanded, not of anyone in particular. Who made the decision to move these patients? That's not standard protocol for it's standard for a multiple armed intruder situation with compromised exits, Dana said, not slowing down as she passed him. The mobile patients are going to the back corridor. The non-mobile are going into the trauma rooms. I'd suggest you go to Trauma 1. Aldrin's expression went through several stages. I'm the chief of this department. I give the orders here. You do not. Then give them, Dana said. but give them in the same direction I'm already moving, because we have maybe 4 minutes before whoever is in this building reaches this department." She didn't wait to see what he decided. She had already moved on to the next thing. She was at the north end of the ER when she heard the first sound from the corridor. Not a shout, not a shot, but the particular quality of movement that too many bodies in a confined space makes when they aren't trying to be quiet anymore. She positioned herself behind the supply cart near the corridor junction, not because she had a plan to heroically intervene, but because she needed to see what was coming before she could make any useful decision about it. 4 men. She counted from the reflection in the window of the darkened office across from her position, a trick that took a specific kind of practiced eye to execute without obviously looking. 4 men, armed, moving with the formation discipline that comes from training rather than improvisation. They weren't panicking, they weren't random, they were looking for something specific, moving through the space with the efficiency of people who had done walkthroughs in their heads before they walked in. One of them had a photograph. She couldn't see the image from where she was, but she could see the way he kept checking it against the faces of staff members he passed, and that told her everything she needed to know about what this was and why a hospital full of sick people had suddenly become a target. She stepped back from the junction, turned, and moved quickly toward the trauma rooms. Lorraine was in the corridor outside trauma too, one hand against the door. She looked at Dana with a question she didn't have to say out loud. 4, Dana said, quiet enough that only Lorraine caught it. Trained, looking for a specific person. She paused. Get inside, keep everyone down, and keep it dark. Don't open the door unless I knock 3 times, pause, then twice. What are you? Lorraine started. Instead, Dana said. Please. Lorraine went. The door closed. Dana turned back toward the main ER floor and took a slow breath in through her nose. The overhead lights were still on, which was a problem. The PA system had gone silent, which might mean the communications room was compromised. From somewhere on the far side of the department, she could hear a patient crying. A high, reedy sound that she hoped to God the people coming through this building were too focused on their target to trace to its source. She stepped out of the back corridor and into the main ER floor, in plain view, precisely at the moment the 4 men came around the corner from the north entrance. The leader, she identified him by his position, slightly ahead, head up, reading the room, stopped when he saw her. The others fanned slightly. She was standing in the middle of the floor in her blue scrubs with the coffee stain on the left sleeve. She looked, she knew, exactly like what she'd spent 7 months training herself to look like. Ordinary, tired, harmless. Nurse, the leader said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an identification. That's right. She kept her hands visible and her voice flat. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he held up the photograph. Where is this person? She looked at the photograph. The image was of a man, mid-30s, military bearing even in the civilian clothes he was wearing in the picture, a long scar running from his left ear toward his jaw. She had never seen him before. But the photograph itself told her 3 things. It was taken with a long-range lens, the man in it didn't know the picture was being taken, and the corner of the image bore a watermark that she recognized from a world she was not supposed to know anything about. She looked back up at the leader, kept her expression exactly where it had been. I don't recognize him, she said. He held her gaze. He was testing her, running the same read on her that she was running on him, and he was good at it. Not good enough, but good. You're not scared, he said, and it wasn't a question. People come in here hurt every night, Dana said. I don't have the bandwidth for scared. Something moved in his expression, not quite suspicion, not quite the opposite. He glanced at one of the men to his right, and in that quarter second of divided attention, Dana finished the inventory she'd been running since they walked in. Weapons holstered, not drawn. They were trying not to create a spectacle. One man slightly favoring his left leg, which would affect his mobility if it came to that. The one on the far right was watching the exits more than watching her, which meant he was the one they'd posted for containment. She needed to know what was in the north corridor before she made any moves. She needed 30 more seconds. If you're looking for someone in this hospital, she said, I can pull the intake log from the last 6 hours. If he came in through the ER, he's in the system. The leader looked at her, then he nodded. Show me. She walked to the nursing station, moving slowly and deliberately, and the four of them came with her, which was exactly what she needed. At the nursing station, she had angles on the full ER floor, and from this position she could see what she hadn't been able to see from the corridor junction. A fifth man, posted near the main entrance, and on a gurney against the east wall, half hidden behind a curtain, a figure in civilian clothes with military boots, left hand pressed hard against his own abdomen, eyes closed, clearly trying not to be seen. She recognized the scar from the photograph before she'd fully processed that she was looking at him. The man they were hunting was already here, and he was bleeding badly enough that without intervention in the next 20 minutes, the question of whether these men found him would become irrelevant. Dana turned back to the intake computer, positioned her body between the screen and the curtained bay, and began typing with the careful focus of someone doing exactly what they'd been asked to do. Behind her, the leader moved 2 steps to the right to see the screen better, which put his back to the main entrance. And in the east wall curtained bay, the man with the scar opened his eyes and looked directly at Dana. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the screen, but her right hand, resting below the edge of the desk where no one could see it, made a single motion, 2 fingers extended, then folded down, a gesture so small it was barely a gesture at all. The man behind the curtain went still. The leader leaned closer to look at the intake log, and Dana felt the weight of the room, the 43 patients hidden in back corridors and locked trauma rooms, the 11 staff members who had trusted her to know what she was doing, the bleeding man behind a curtain on the east wall, and the 4 armed men standing close enough that she could hear them breathing. She had been in worse positions. She had been in positions that had ended badly despite everything she knew and everything she could do, and she had walked away from those positions carrying the kind of weight that doesn't transfer to paper or get filed in any official record. That was the part nobody in this hospital knew. "He's not in the log," she said, turning from the screen, and as she did, the lights in the main ER corridor went out. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds of complete black in the main ER corridor, long enough for Dana to drop below the desk level, long enough for the leader to take 1 step backward and reach for the weapon at his hip, long enough for the man behind the curtain on the east wall to make a sound. Short, involuntary, the sound of someone whose body has decided it's done cooperating. Then the emergency generators kicked in and the backup lighting came up, dim and orange-tinted, casting the ER in the kind of light that makes everything look worse than it is. Or in this case, exactly as bad as it was. The leader had his weapon out now. The other 3 had followed. The containment man near the entrance had moved inward, closing the perimeter, and Dana registered all of this from behind the desk, in the time it took her to decide that the next 30 seconds were going to determine how the rest of this night went for everyone in the building. She stood up, slowly, hands visible, nothing in them. "The generator switch is on a 12-second delay," she said, keeping her voice at the same flat register she'd been using since they walked in. "It does that every time there's a power fluctuation. Happens twice a week." The leader looked at her. His weapon was pointed at the space between them, not directly at her. A trained posture, not a panic posture. He was still thinking. That was either good or bad, depending on what he decided. "Move away from the desk," he said. She moved. She came around the side of the nursing station and stood in the open floor, and she made sure as she did it that her path put her 8 feet closer to the curtained bay on the east wall and no closer to any of the 4 men. The leader's eyes went to the curtain. She had maybe 3 seconds before he crossed the floor and pulled it back. "There's something you should know," she said. He stopped. Not because he trusted her, she could see he didn't, but because people with training don't ignore information even when they suspect it's being used against them. "What?" "The man you're looking for. If he came in here injured and didn't register at intake, he's not going to be able to move." She paused. "And if you find him in a state where he can't be moved, whatever he's carrying, whatever you came here for, is somewhere in this building, not on his person. People in his line of work don't keep material on them when they're compromised." The leader went very still. Dana kept her expression exactly neutral. She had no idea whether any of that was true. She was building a framework out of inference and pressure and the few things she'd read from the photograph, and she was doing it in real time, which was not the same as doing it correctly. But it gave him something to think about that wasn't the curtain. "His line of work," the leader said. You know him. I know the photograph you showed me, she said, and I know what that watermark in the corner means. That landed. She watched it land. The slight tightening around his eyes, the recalculation happening behind them. Who are you? He said. Before she could answer, the curtain moved. Not because anyone pulled it, because the man behind it had tried to shift his position and lost the fight with his own body. The curtain swung outward, caught the edge of the gurney, and fell half open, and there he was, the man from the photograph, on his back on the gurney, one arm pressed against his abdomen and soaked through with blood that had long since gone dark, his eyes open and looking at the ceiling with the specific unfocused quality of someone running on will alone. The leader moved toward him. Dana moved faster. She was between the leader and the gurney in 2 steps. Not heroically, not in the manner of someone who had decided to sacrifice herself, but in the efficient, close-quarters way of someone who has done the geometry and determined that the angle of the leader's approach to the gurney put her body in the optimal position to interrupt it without triggering the other 3. It was the kind of move that looks reckless from the outside and is, from the inside, extremely calculated. The leader stopped 6 inches from her. He was taller than she was by 5 or 6 inches, and he used that, leaning forward slightly, weapon still raised. "Step aside," he said. "He's bleeding internally," Dana said. "If you move him, he dies in under 20 minutes. If you want whatever he's carrying, you need him alive long enough to tell you where it is, and you need someone who can keep him that way." A long pause. In that pause, she could hear the patient who'd been crying earlier, still going, quieter now, further back. She could hear the hum of the backup generator. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was elevated but not as elevated as it should have been, and that gap had always unsettled the people who knew what it meant. "You can keep him that way," the leader said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Then do it, but if you try anything—" "I know," she said, and turned to the gurney. Up close, the man was in worse shape than she'd assessed from a distance. The wound was in his lower left abdomen, exit wound on the back suggesting a through-and-through that had missed the major vessels. Otherwise, he'd already be gone. But the bleeding was consistent, and his pressure was going to be critical. She needed an IV line, fluids, pressure dressing, and she needed the imaging equipment in trauma too to rule out what she couldn't see. She needed, in other words, things she was going to have to go and get, while 4 armed men watched her do it. "I have to go to the supply room," she said, not to the leader specifically, addressing the room. "I need materials. I'll be back in 90 seconds. "Marco goes with you," the leader said. She didn't argue. She walked to the supply room with a man named Marco 2 feet behind her, pulled what she needed with the efficiency of someone who had restocked that supply room 100 times and knew exactly where everything lived, and walked back. 90 seconds. She had counted. What she did not do in those 90 seconds was anything that could have been characterized as threatening or suspicious. What she did do, in the 12 seconds Marco spent looking at something on the shelf near the door, was palm a single item from the lower rack and transfer it to her scrub pocket with a motion that required the kind of fine motor control that doesn't come from nursing school. She didn't examine whether she'd need it. She just made sure it was there. Working on the wounded man with an audience was something she'd done before, which didn't make it comfortable. She moved through the immediate interventions without narrating them, which was her normal mode. She had a habit of working quietly that some nurses found unsettling and that patients generally found calming. She placed the IV on the first attempt despite his veins being constricted from blood loss, got the fluids running, applied the pressure dressing with enough force to make him flinch and make a sound through his teeth. "Hold that," she told him, pressing his own hand against the dressing. He was conscious enough to comply. She looked at his face. He was looking at her. Up close, the scar she'd seen in the photograph ran from the edge of his jaw toward his left ear, older than it looked in the image. Years old, healed clean. His eyes were dark and, despite everything, sharply focused on her face. "You're not hospital staff," he said. His voice was rough, quiet. "I'm a nurse," she said, the same way she always said it. "Uh-huh." His jaw tightened as she adjusted the dressing. "Where'd you do your trauma rotation?" She didn't answer. He looked at her for another moment, then something in his face shifted. Not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated. He pressed the dressing and looked at the ceiling and didn't ask anything else, which told her he'd made a decision about her, and the decision wasn't wrong, even if she wasn't going to confirm it. The leader had been watching from 6 feet away. Now he came closer. How long? Before he's stable enough to move? 3 hours minimum, and that's if I can get him to imaging to rule out organ involvement. She glanced up. I can't do that here. You're not taking him anywhere. Then I'm doing the best I can with what's here, and the answer to your question is I don't know. Could be 3 hours. Could be he doesn't make it at all. I'm not going to lie to you about the math. She wasn't sure why she'd added that last sentence. It was true, but it was also the kind of transparency that didn't serve any tactical purpose. Maybe she was tired. Maybe something about the situation had gotten under the professional surface she was trying to maintain into the layer beneath it where she was still, despite everything, a person. The leader studied her face. You're not scared, he said, and this time it wasn't flat. It carried something, the edge of something that might have been respect and might have been unease. I told you, she said, I don't have the bandwidth. Most nurses I've walked into rooms with are on the floor by now. Then you've been in the wrong rooms. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved back and Dana exhaled slowly through her nose and went back to work. Dr. Aldrin appeared 20 minutes into it. She heard him before she saw him. The voice, first coming from the back corridor, raised in the tone he used when he was performing authority for an audience rather than actually exercising it. She turned to see him at the edge of the ER floor, still in his white coat, face flushed from the sustained adrenaline of having been in Trauma Room 1 for the past half hour. He had apparently decided he was done staying put. This is completely unacceptable, he announced. I am the chief of this emergency department and I demand to know what is happening. These patients are my responsibility and you have no right to... The leader raised his weapon, not pointed directly, raised, visible, a clear indication of presence. Aldrin stopped. In the silence that followed, Dana watched his face go through the same journey every person's face goes through when theory meets reality. He had known, abstractly, that there were armed men in the building. He had not apparently fully integrated what that meant until he was standing on the ER floor looking at one. Doctor, Dana said carefully, come stand over here, please. Aldrin looked at her. The expression she'd expected, irritation at being directed by her, was there, but muted now, pushed down under something more urgent. He came to stand near the nursing station, and she positioned herself between him and the leader with the practiced invisibility of someone rearranging geometry. What is that man doing on my gurney? Aldrin said, low, clearly trying to sound like he was still in charge of something. He needs trauma care. I'm providing it. He stopped. You placed that IV. Yes. He's been assessed? He was looking at the patient's vitals on the portable monitor she'd clipped up, reading the numbers despite himself, the physician in him cutting through the rest of it. His pressure is 60 over... I know. I'm managing it. Aldrin looked at the IV line, the dressing, the monitor, and she watched him arrive at the same assessment she had. Not pleasantly, because it meant she'd been right and doing the right thing without him, which was the specific combination of facts he found hardest to accept. The fluid rate, he said finally. It should be. It's adjusted for the apparent blood loss and his current pressure. I'll step it up in 10 minutes if he hasn't stabilized. She paused. If you want to stand here and consult, I'll take the help. But we need to keep our voices down. A long beat. Fine, Aldrin said. The word cost him something. She didn't examine what. There wasn't time. They worked the patient together for the next 15 minutes, which was stranger than it should have been, or stranger than Dana would have expected 7 months ago, before she had fully mapped the distance between who Aldrin was in the department hierarchy and who he was when hierarchy was the least relevant thing in the room. He was, when he set down the posturing, a reasonable physician. He caught one thing she'd missed, a secondary bruising pattern on the patient's side that suggested a rib contusion. And she caught two things he would have missed. They didn't discuss this, they just worked. The patient, the man with the scar, drifted in and out. At one point he came up sharp, grabbed Dana's wrist and said clearly, "Drive." Just that one word. She looked at him. Drive what? But he'd already gone back under, and she filed the words somewhere in her mind and kept moving. It was the leader's phone that changed things. He'd been checking it intermittently, the same way people check phones when they're waiting for an update that keeps not arriving. Short glances, then away, then again. 40 minutes into the standoff, he checked it and didn't look away. He read something. He read it twice. Then he crossed the floor to where Dana was working and said quiet enough that Aldrin, standing on the other side of the gurney, probably didn't catch it. How much longer? I told you, I can't give you a number. Give me one anyway. She looked at the patient's vitals. The pressure had come up slightly, not enough. An hour before I'd feel comfortable saying he can be moved without a high probability of killing him. We don't have an hour. She looked up at him. Then you have a problem. His jaw tightened. He glanced back at his men, something moving in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not panic, he wasn't built for that, but something close to recalculation under time pressure. Is there another way out of this building? He said. And there it was. Whatever was on that phone, it had changed their exit plan. Something had shifted outside the hospital. Something had closed off, or was about to close off, and he was asking her because she was the only person in the room he'd decided might give him a straight answer. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why would I tell you that?" He held her gaze. "Because you want them out of here as much as I want to leave." That was, she had to admit, not entirely wrong. She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. Running through the exit she knew, the loading dock on the south side, the maintenance tunnel that connected to the parking structure, the fire escape access that Hartwell's facilities department had been cited for blocking 3 times in the past 2 years. She was still thinking when the sound came from outside. Not loud at first. A low rising frequency that she identified before she consciously processed it. The particular acoustic signature of multiple vehicle engines running in formation, approaching from more than one direction simultaneously. The leader heard it too. She saw him hear it. He walked quickly to the window at the end of the ER corridor and looked out, and Dana didn't have to see his face to know what she'd know from the sound alone. She could tell from the way he went still. She looked at the man on the gurney. He had opened his eyes again, and this time when he looked at her, there was more in it. Focus, recognition, something that might have been the specific relief of a person who has been running a very long time and has just heard something that tells them the running might almost be over. Outside, through the corridor window, the parking lot was filling with light. Blue and white, primarily, and the high-powered variety that comes from vehicles built to make statements before anyone has to say a word. Between the light sources, Dana caught the shape of 2 figures in tactical gear moving along the exterior wall toward the north entrance, moving with the compressed, efficient urgency of people who have done this many times and are not planning to negotiate for very long. She turned back to the ER floor. The leader was still at the window. His men had closed in behind him, instinctively, a formation shift that took them 3 steps away from their previous positions and, incidentally, 3 steps away from the nursing station. The nursing station where the patient's chart was logged. The nursing station where the emergency communication panel was mounted underneath the desk, on the left-hand side, behind a panel she had identified on her 2nd week at Hartwell and never had reason to mention to anyone. She looked at Aldrin. He was watching the leader. She caught his eye, held it for exactly 1 second, and then looked at the desk. Then back at him. He frowned, looked at the desk, looked back at her. She made the smallest possible motion, 2 fingers, pointing down. Aldrin stared at her, then, slowly, comprehension. It crossed his face in parts. Surprise, then something she hadn't expected, something that might have been, against everything, a threat of trust. The leader turned from the window. His expression had resolved into the particular set of someone who has accepted a bad situation and is now operating inside it rather than around it. "We're going to need the nurse," he said to his men, and the way he said it made the hair on Dana's arms stand up. He crossed the floor toward her, and she had a single second to make the decision she'd been building toward since the moment they walked in. Not a dramatic decision, not a cinematic one, just the decision of a person who had run the math on every available option and arrived finally at the only answer that added up. She dropped below the desk. Her hand found the panel on the left side, behind the false backing, and she hit the emergency transmit button with the flat of her palm, once, hard, and then she was back up before the leader had covered half the distance between them, hands visible, expression unchanged. He stopped 2 feet from her. "What did you just do?" he said. "Nothing," she said. He didn't believe her. She could see he didn't believe her, but she held his gaze with the same flat steadiness she'd been holding it with all night. And the problem with a person who looks like she has nothing to prove is that it's very hard to catch her in the act of proving something. Outside, the lights kept multiplying, and in the east wall gurney, the man with the scar turned his head and looked at Dana with an expression she couldn't categorize. It wasn't gratitude exactly, and it wasn't surprise. It was closer to recognition, like he knew exactly what she'd just done, like he'd been waiting to find out whether she would. The leader's name, Dana found out later, was Renner. She didn't know that yet. In the moment, he was still just the man 2 feet from her face, reading her expression for something she wasn't giving him, with the sound of vehicle engines intensifying outside and his men behind him running the same internal calculation she could see playing out in the set of his jaw. "Move away from the desk," he said. She moved, not because she was afraid, the window on that had mostly closed, but because she'd done what she needed to do and there was nothing left the desk could give her. She came around to the open floor again, and he followed her with his eyes the whole way, and she could feel the quality of his attention shifting. He'd been suspicious of her since the beginning. Now, he was certain. The problem for him was that certainty arrived about 60 seconds too late. Outside, the vehicles had stopped moving. That specific silence, engines cutting in sequence, multiple units coordinating, meant they were positioning rather than approaching. Whoever was out there wasn't breaching yet. They were establishing a perimeter, running communications, doing the methodical front-end work that preceded entry. She'd seen it from the other side enough times to read it from this one. It bought her maybe 4 minutes, maybe less. Renner turned to the man nearest him, not Marco, the other one, the one she'd mentally tagged as the communications anchor because he was the only one who'd checked his earpiece more than twice. "Status." The man shook his head. Whatever channel he was trying to reach had gone quiet. That was the moment something shifted in the room, not dramatically. The weapons didn't come down, the body language didn't change. But Dana had been watching rooms full of people under pressure for long enough to feel it when the internal temperature crossed a threshold. These 4 men had come in with a plan. The plan was failing. And people whose plans fail in closed spaces with no exit options become a different kind of problem than the kind she'd been managing. She looked at the man on the gurney. His pressure had come up another few points, still not where she wanted it, but moving in the right direction. His eyes were open and tracking the room with the careful, economical attention of someone who has learned to assess situations from a position of physical disadvantage. She recognized the mode. She'd operated in it herself. She went back to him, not because the clinical picture had changed, but because being near the patient gave her a position in the room that none of the 4 men could reasonably object to, and from that position she could see all of them. She adjusted the fluid rate, checked the dressing, still holding, though the outer layer was saturated and she needed to change it. And while she worked, she said, low and level, meant only for him. "Can you talk?" "Been talking," he said. "Coherently, to me. Right now." A pause. "Yeah." "How many exits do you know about in this building?" He looked at her. Whatever he saw in her face, and she was careful about what she let into her face, made him recalibrate. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because you came in here knowing someone was going to follow you, which means you planned for the exit before you planned for anything else. So either you know something about this building I don't, or you came in here planning to go back out the same way you came in, which given your current condition was optimistic." A long beat. Something moved in his expression. Respect, maybe, or its more cautious cousin. "Loading dock," he said. "South side. There's a maintenance access that runs under the east wing." "I know the loading dock. The maintenance access is locked from the south end." "Not anymore." She held his gaze for a moment. "When did you unlock it?" "Before I came in through the north entrance." She filed this, adjusted the dressing. "What's your name?" Doesn't matter. It does when I'm filing the medical chart. What do I call you? Another pause, shorter. Callum. Okay, Callum. She pulled a fresh dressing layer from the supply tray. When whoever's outside comes through that door, you are going to need to be able to identify yourself immediately and clearly, because the first 10 seconds of a breach are the most dangerous, and you are the person in this room who looks most like a combatant. Understood? He was quiet for a moment. You've been on the other side of a breach, he said. I'm a nurse, she said, for the third time that night. He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way, given everything, but it got close. A tuck. The secondary complication arrived before the breach did, because that was how nights like this worked. They didn't give you problems sequentially. They gave them to you in clusters, and the skill wasn't in solving each one, but in triaging them in the right order. The complication was Petra Hollis. Petra came through the door from the back corridor at a run. Not a controlled run, a panicked one. The specific gait of someone who has been holding still for a long time and has finally lost the capacity to hold still anymore. She came through the door and stopped in the middle of the ER floor with her eyes going to the four armed men and her face doing the thing faces do when the body overrides everything the mind has been trying to maintain. Marco grabbed her arm. Let go, Dana said. She said it the way she'd said things all night, not loudly, not dramatically, just with a precision of tone that didn't leave much room for alternate interpretations. Marco looked at Renner. Renner looked at Dana. Then he nodded, once, and Marco released Petra's arm. Dana crossed to Petra and put one hand on her shoulder, turning her slightly so her back was to the men. Hey, look at me. Petra looked at her. Her eyes were wet and her breathing was wrong, shallow, too fast. I need you to slow your breathing down, Dana said. In through your nose, 4 counts. You can do that. There are people in trauma too who need... Petra's voice broke on the last word. I know. Tell me what you need. Mrs. Kaminsky, the lady with the fractured wrist. She's having chest pain, and I don't know if it's... How long? Maybe 20 minutes. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to open the door, and... You did right, Dana said, and meant it. Is she conscious? Is she talking to you? Yes, she's scared. She keeps saying her arm is tingling. Left arm. Dana ran the numbers fast. A woman with a fractured wrist who was scared and in pain, presenting with chest discomfort and arm tingling, which could be anxiety-driven or could be something that required intervention in the next hour. She looked at the supply tray near the gurney, looked at Petra, made the calculation. Go back to her. I'm going to give you aspirin from the supply tray. 4 tablets, 81 milligrams each. Have her chew them. Keep her calm, keep her lying down, and if her pain goes above a 7 or she loses consciousness, knock on the door of Trauma 1 and get Dr. Aldrin. Petra stared at her. Aspirin. Unless she's allergic. Is she allergic? She said she takes ibuprofen for... Then she can take the aspirin. Go. Petra went. Dana pulled the aspirin from the tray, handed it through the door before it closed, and turned back to the room. Renner was watching her. She's 14 months out of school, Dana said, not as an explanation, but as a statement of fact. He didn't respond to that. He was watching her with an expression she'd been trying to categorize all night and couldn't quite land on. It wasn't what she'd expected from a man in his position, wasn't the flat instrumental calculation she'd been braced for. There was something in it that was more complicated than that, something that might have been recognition of a different kind. How long have you been a nurse? He said. 7 months at this hospital. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. Long enough. Outside, something changed. A shift in the sound pattern, the particular quality of silence that precedes organized movement. She felt it before she heard it, the same way you feel a change in air pressure before rain. Renner felt it too. She could see it. I need you to make a decision, she said. Right now, before whoever is outside comes through that entrance. His jaw tightened. You don't give me... You can hold this position until they breach, she said. And when they come through, this ER becomes a combat zone with 43 patients in it who can't move on their own. Or you can let me walk your people out through the south maintenance access, which Callum over there tells me you already know is unlocked, and clear this building before the entry team comes in." Renner went very still. "You do that." "I want them out of here," she said. "You said so yourself." "And Callum?" "Callum is a patient. He stays." A long pause. Renner glanced at the man on the gurney. Something moved between them. Not friendship, not its opposite. Something more complicated. Dana didn't try to read it. She just waited. "You're not going to tell them about the access," Renner said. "I'm going to tell them everything," she said, "but not for the next 6 minutes." It was an honest answer. She watched him process that, the honesty of it, which was the only currency she had that meant anything in this room. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then, "Marco, Reyes, north." They moved. The containment man at the entrance fell in. Renner paused in front of her, close, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something. He didn't. He just looked at her one more time with that expression she couldn't categorize, and then he and his men were gone through the south corridor. Dana stood in the empty ER and exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. Then she went back to Callum. "What babas?" The breach came 90 seconds later and she was ready for it. North entrance, as she'd expected. 2-point entry, flashlight beams preceding the figures by half a second, tactical gear, weapons up, moving with the compressed efficiency she'd been anticipating. She was standing in the middle of the ER floor with both hands raised and her back to Callum's gurney when they came in, and she said clearly and immediately, "Nurse, 1 patient, critical, no active threats." They didn't lower their weapons. That was standard. She kept her hands up and her voice level and let them run the room, which took about 45 seconds, checking the bays, the corridor access, the trauma rooms. A third figure came in behind the first 2, and she knew from his posture before she saw his face that he was the ranking officer. He was a tall man, mid-40s, carrying the kind of composure that has been built up over years rather than adopted. Not performed calm, but the real thing, the residue of having been in enough situations that this particular variety of bad had stopped being novel. He looked at Dana, looked at Callum, looked back at Dana. "You the one who hit the emergency transmit," he said. "Yes." "Commander Ray Decker, Federal Tactical Unit." He hadn't lowered his weapon either, but the angle had shifted. She was no longer in the center of it. "Where are the individuals who entered this building?" "South maintenance access. I gave them a 6-minute window approximately 3 minutes ago." Decker looked at her with an expression that was not quite what she'd expected. "You let them go." "I cleared the building so your entry didn't happen in a room with 43 non-ambulatory patients. The south access exits into the lower parking structure, and if you have units on the perimeter, you should already have them." A pause. Then Decker keyed his radio and said a location code she didn't know, listened to a response, said "confirmed," and lowered his weapon. He looked at her again. "Name?" "Dana Marsh, ER nurse." His expression shifted in a way she recognized, the micro-recalibration, the same one she'd been seeing on faces all night, different flavors of the same thing. She was getting tired of it. She turned back to Callum. "He needs surgery," she said. "Now, not in an hour. His pressure has stabilized temporarily, but the internal bleeding isn't resolved, and the longer he's in a non-surgical environment—" "Medical team is on approach," Decker said, already moving. 2 minutes out. He came to stand on the other side of the gurney and looked at Callum, and the look that passed between them was not the look of a commander and a subject. It was something older and more specific. "You made it," Decker said. "Mostly," Callum said. "The package." "Secure." Callum's eyes moved briefly to Dana, then back to Decker. "Don't let them move me until she says it's okay." Decker looked at Dana. She was already checking the monitor. Pressure had dropped 2 points in the last 4 minutes. "Tell your medical team he's going to need a type and cross, O negative to start, and if they're not set up for abdominal surgery, they need to be transporting him, not treating him." "Noted," Decker said, and got on the radio. Dana stepped back from the gurney slightly. Not far, she wasn't leaving him, but enough to take a breath and look at the room. The ER was empty in the way rooms are empty after something has happened in them. The residue of everyone who'd been there still somehow present in the arrangement of displaced chairs and overturned equipment and the coffee stain on the floor near the nursing station that she realized, looking at it, was from the cup she'd put down when the lights first went out. Aldrin came out from somewhere. She wasn't sure where he'd been in the last 10 minutes and didn't have the energy to reconstruct it. He came to stand near the nursing station and looked at the room and then at her, and she knew from his expression that he'd been listening to at least the last part of the conversation with Decker. He didn't say anything immediately. She didn't look at him directly. She was watching Callum's vitals, watching the number, waiting for the medical team she could hear coming through the north entrance. "Marsh," Aldrin said. She looked at him. "The aspirin call." He stopped. Started again. "For Mrs. Kaminsky. In trauma 2. A pause. That was the right call. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the monitor. "I know," she said. It wasn't gracious, she knew that, but she was very tired, and she had been in this building for 11 hours, and she had just spent the last 90 minutes managing 4 armed men and 43 patients and a physician who couldn't get out of his own way, and she didn't have anything gracious left. Aldrin accepted it. That she hadn't expected. The medical team arrived. 3 of them, combat-trained from the look of their kit, moving with the directed urgency of people who'd been given a specific picture and were now performing it. She briefed the lead medic in 45 seconds, all the relevant information, none of the context, fluid rate, current pressure, location and character of the wound, the rib contusion Aldrin had caught, what she'd given him, and when. The medic listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. They were preparing to move Callum when he caught Dana's wrist again. Not the desperate grip from earlier, deliberate. He waited until she looked at him. "You said you were a nurse," he said. "I am." "What else?" She looked at him. She had been careful, all night. Careful in the way she'd been careful for 3 years. The way you're careful when you've made a deliberate decision about what to be and what to leave behind. But careful had a ceiling, and she'd been bumping against it for the last hour, and she could see from his face that he wasn't asking because he was curious. He was asking because he already knew, or knew enough that the question was almost rhetorical. "You going to be okay?" she said. "Probably." He held her gaze. "Osprey 7. She went still. It was 2 words, a designation, the kind that didn't appear in any documentation that regular human beings had access to, the kind attached to operations that officially hadn't happened, involving people who officially hadn't been where they were. She knew it because she had been there. Not with him. She'd never seen his face before tonight. But in the same category of operational reality, the same classified geography that the rest of the world called rumors, and the people who inhabited it called Tuesday. She knew it the way you know a piece of code when you've used the language. "How do you know that?" she said. Low. Only for him. "Because I was looking for you," he said. "Not tonight. For 3 years." His pressure monitor beeped and the medic next to her said something she didn't fully hear. "Dana, they told us you were dead after the extraction failed. The whole unit was told." "We need to move him," the lead medic said, and Dana stepped back automatically, the muscle memory of clinical practice overriding everything else. They moved him. She let them. She stood in the middle of the ER floor and watched them take Callum through the north entrance on the gurney, and she didn't move, and she didn't speak, and in the backup lighting that was still the only illumination in the room, her face showed exactly nothing, but her hands, down at her sides, were not steady. Commander Decker appeared at her shoulder. He had been on the radio for the last 3 minutes, and she hadn't been tracking him, which was a lapse she registered with the distant self-criticism of someone who had been operating at capacity for too long. "We're going to need a full statement," he said. "I know. Tonight, before you leave the building." "I know." He paused. She could feel him deciding something, the same way she'd felt Renner deciding things, but with different weight behind it. "Marsh," he said. "Is that your full name?" She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has done enough background checks in his career to know when the information returned is incomplete, and who has enough experience to know that incomplete information about a person who did what she did tonight means something specific. "It's the name on my badge," she said. Uh-huh. He looked at her badge, then back at her face. How long have you been at Hartwell General? 7 months. And before that? A long pause. In the distance, through the north entrance, she could hear Callum's gurney wheels on the exterior pavement, and the medics and the suppressed urgency of people transporting a critical patient, and underneath all of it, the beginning of something she hadn't let herself feel all night. Something that wasn't fear and wasn't relief and didn't have a clean name. Before that, she said, I was somewhere else. Decker looked at her for a long moment. Then his radio went off. Not a tone, a voice, and the voice said a word that she felt in the center of her sternum like a physical impact. The word was a name. Her name. Not Dana Marsh, the other one. The one that had appeared on rosters she wasn't supposed to know existed attached to operational histories that couldn't be subpoenaed, and personnel files that were currently, as far as anyone officially knew, stamped deceased. She looked at Decker. He was looking at her with an expression that had finally resolved into something she could read. He knew exactly who she was. And from the way he was looking at her, she understood that whatever Callum had been carrying into this building tonight, whatever had brought 4 armed men through a hospital's front doors, whatever Osprey 7 meant in this context, in this moment, it was connected to her in ways that 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility had not, in the end, managed to prevent. The emergency lighting buzzed overhead. Outside, the parking lot was still full of blue-white light. Dana Marsh stood in the wreckage of the night shift and waited for whatever came next. The radio voice said it once and did not repeat it. Decker reached up and turned the volume down on his earpiece. A small, deliberate motion that told her the name had not been meant for general broadcast. Whoever was on the other end of that transmission had sent it narrowband, direct to him, which meant they had been waiting for the right moment to send it, which meant they had been monitoring this situation long enough to know the right moment had arrived. She had been made before she hit the transmit button. Maybe well before. How long? She said. Decker looked at her steadily. How long what? How long have you known where I was? A pause that told her everything before he spoke. That's a conversation for somewhere that isn't here. Then we need to get to somewhere that isn't here. He nodded once. He pulled out a phone. Not a standard issue, a secondary device, the kind that meant the conversation he was about to have wouldn't route through anything logged, and stepped 4 feet away to make a call. Dana watched him without appearing to watch him, which was a skill she had once been formally evaluated on and scored well. She looked at the ER around her. The backup lights were still throwing everything in orange-tinted dim. The floor had equipment on it that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. A displaced IV stand. A chair from the waiting area that had migrated into the main bay space. The detritus of a night that had moved too fast for anyone to keep the room organized. She had spent 7 months learning every inch of this department, and right now it looked like somewhere she'd never been. Lorraine came out of trauma room 2. She looked at Dana first, a long, assessing look, then at Decker, then at the tactical personnel still moving through the north corridor. Dana, her voice was careful. Are you okay? Yes. Then, because Lorraine deserved more than one word, Mrs. Kaminsky, how is she? Stable. The aspirin helped. She stopped complaining about her arm about 15 minutes ago, which either means it worked or she got too tired to complain. Lorraine paused. Petra is with her. Good. The patients in the corridor need, I know, get them back to their bays, run reassessments on anyone who was mobilized, flag anyone who had a procedure in progress when this started. Dana was already moving toward the nursing station. And Lorraine, document everything. What happened, what time, what decisions were made, and by whom. Do it now, before anyone asks you to wait. Lorraine looked at her with an expression Dana couldn't fully decode. Something between recognition and something older, something that didn't have a word. Okay, she said, and went. Aldrin was still near the nursing station. He had been there, Dana realized, for the last 10 minutes. Not hiding, not fleeing, just occupying the space with the quiet of a man who has run out of performance. He looked exhausted in a way that went below the surface. The kind of exhaustion that happens when a version of yourself you've been maintaining for a long time turns out not to be true. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she didn't feel the things she'd expected to feel either. Not satisfaction, not the specific vindication of being right in front of someone who'd dismissed her. What she felt was mostly just tired, and something else underneath the tired that she couldn't examine yet. "I'll need you to document your clinical decisions tonight," she said. "All of them, including the ones made after the situation developed." He looked at her. "Including the ones you made." "Mine are already documented." She tapped the side of her head, and it wasn't meant as a demonstration. She meant literally in her own records, in the encrypted log she'd been keeping since week 2 at Hartwell. "Yours need to be in the official file." A pause. "You've been keeping records?" "Yes." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the implications of it, what it meant about the previous 7 months, about the gap between the way he'd seen her and what she'd actually been doing. His jaw worked slightly. "The complaint you filed in October," he said, "about the shift reassignments. HR has it." "I didn't know." "You knew the reassignments were happening," she said. "Whether you initiated them or allowed them is a different question." She looked at him directly. "That's also documented." It wasn't a threat. She didn't need it to be. The documentation existed, the events existed, and whatever happened in the next days and weeks would arrive at its own conclusions. She wasn't interested in prosecuting him in the middle of the wreckage of the worst shift either of them had ever worked. She was interested in the patience, and in getting through the next few hours, and in the conversation with Decker that was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Aldrin looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for a chart from the nursing station, the closest patient file, and started doing exactly what she'd asked him to do. She let it go. Decker came back from his call 11 minutes later, and something had changed in his posture. Not loosened, Decker didn't appear to be the loosening type, but the specific tension of someone managing a fluid situation had shifted into the different tension of someone who has received instructions and is now executing them. "We're going to a secondary location," he said. "Administrative conference room if it's accessible. 3rd floor, north stairwell, or the elevator if it's running." "Generators running the elevator." He looked at her. "I need you to understand something before we go up there." She waited. "The people coming into this conversation, some of them are going to be people you have opinions about," he said. "I'm asking you to hold those opinions until after the conversation." "Are you asking me that because you think I won't control myself, or because you think the opinions are going to be strong enough that controlling myself will be difficult?" He looked at her for a beat. "Second one," he said. She nodded. "Understood." The elevator was running. They rode up in silence, Decker and 2 of his people and Dana, who stood with her back to the wall and her arms at her sides and watched the floor counter change and thought about Osprey 7 and what it meant that Callum had known to say those 2 words to her specifically, and whether it was coincidence that he'd ended up in her ER on this particular Tuesday or the furthest thing from coincidence, and what the answer to that question said about the last 3 years of her life. The conference room on the 3rd floor was used, under normal circumstances, for administrative meetings, department head reviews, the quarterly budget presentations that she'd been required to attend exactly once and had found remarkable only for how much time was spent discussing parking. It had a long table, 12 chairs, a wall of windows overlooking the parking structure, and a projected screen that someone had already queued up when they arrived. There were 4 people already in the room. 3 of them she didn't know. 2 men and a woman, all in the same category of non-uniformed official that signaled federal without advertising it, the category of people who had learned that the most important things in rooms like this were said in the first 2 minutes and listened to very carefully. The 4th person she knew. She recognized him immediately, before she'd consciously processed his face, from his posture, from the way he occupied space, from a quality of stillness that she had observed in exactly one other person in her life, and that person was herself. He was 62 years old, gray at the temples, in a suit that had been expensive when he'd put it on this morning, and now looked like he'd been in it for 16 hours, which was probably accurate. His name was Deputy Director Warren Stills. He had run the division that had sent her into the field on 3 separate operations, the last of which had ended with the extraction failure that had been reported, officially, as her death. She had not seen him in 3 years, 2 months and 11 days. He looked at her across the conference table, and his expression did something she hadn't expected. She had expected calculation. That was what she'd always seen from him, the specific calibration of a man who measured everything in terms of operational value. What she saw instead was something more complicated, something that might, in a different light, have looked like guilt. She sat down. She did not speak first. "Dana," he said. "Director Stills." A pause. The other 3 people in the room were very still. "You look well," he said. "I've been a nurse for 7 months," she said. "I look like someone who's been a nurse for 7 months. Why am I in this room?" Stills glanced at Decker, who had taken a position near the door. Then he looked back at her. "Callum Hart, the man you treated tonight. What about him?" "He was carrying documentation, physical documentation, which is why he had to be physically transported rather than transmitting it remotely. Materials that concern a number of operations, active operations, that were run by this division over the last 6 years." She looked at him. "Materials that concern me, among others." She kept her face where it needed to be. "You need to be more specific than that." Stills leaned forward slightly. "The extraction failure. 18 months before you came to Corbin Falls. What happened on that operation has been... The record that was created afterward is not accurate." "I know that," she said. "I was there. What you may not know is that the inaccuracy wasn't administrative error." He paused. "Someone in this division provided operational details to an outside party before your extraction. Your cover was burned before you went in, Dana. The operation was designed to fail." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system. She had considered this. In the 3 years since she'd walked away from a burning vehicle in a country she was not going to think about in a third-floor conference room in Kentucky, she had considered this possibility many times. She had turned it over, examined it, set it down, picked it up again. She had never had the information to confirm or deny it. "Who?" she said. Stills looked at her steadily. "That's what Callum Hart's documentation establishes." The next hour was one of the most controlled hours of her life, which was saying something given the hours that preceded it. They walked her through it in pieces, the documents Callum had been carrying, which a team had extracted and was now processing, the chain of events that had led to a group of armed men entering Hartwell General at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the operational history that connected her extraction failure to a series of other compromised operations over a 6-year span, the name that kept appearing at the center of it, the single name attached to a position within the division that had the access and the motive, and now the documented evidence against it. She listened without speaking, because listening was the most effective thing she could do in that room, and she had learned a long time ago not to spend her attention on reactions when she could spend it on information. When they were done, she said, "Where is he now?" The woman across the table, Decker had introduced her as Agent Sorrell, said, "Currently unaware that Hart made it to your facility or that the documentation is in our custody. He'll find out." "Yes, possibly within the next few hours." "Then you don't have much time." Sorrell looked at Stills. Stills looked at Dana. "There's something else," he said. "Something that concerns Hartwell specifically." She had been waiting for this. She'd been waiting for it since Decker's expression in the elevator, since the specific way the 3 unnamed officials had been watching her since she sat down. Not with the interest of people learning new information, but with the focused attention of people managing a situation they already understood. "Tell me," she said. The individual responsible for compromising those operations needed infrastructure. Communication channels that could pass information without appearing in any federal monitoring system. Stills folded his hands on the table. He used the institutional network of a number of organizations to route that communication. Hospitals, primarily. Facilities with large network footprints and multiple external communication pathways. She looked at him. "Hartwell. Hartwell's administrative network has been carrying encrypted traffic for the last 14 months. We didn't identify the source node until 3 weeks ago." He paused. "The source node is a terminal in the administrative offices on this floor, and the individual at this hospital who was providing access to that terminal." "Aldrin," she said. Stills looked at her. "Marcus Aldrin," she said again. ER chief. He's been running this department for 11 years. He has admin-level access to the hospital network because he was on the infrastructure committee 6 years ago and nobody ever revoked it. She could hear herself saying the words, and at the same time she was hearing something else. The shift reassignments, the missing equipment, the ways she'd been made uncomfortable enough to consider leaving, to consider removing herself from this building. He knew I was here. We believe so, Stills said. He didn't know who I was. Not specifically. But he knew this building was being used, and he knew someone might come looking, and he's been trying to push out anyone whose presence might create a problem. She stopped. He pushed out 2 other staff members in the last 8 months, a resident and a radiology tech. I thought it was just how he ran the department. It wasn't just that, Sorrell said. The room was very quiet. Dana thought about Aldrin coming out to the ER floor during the standoff. The performance of authority, the white coat, the elevated voice. She thought about him working beside her on Callum's gurney, catching the rib contusion, the moment she'd thought that underneath everything he was a reasonable physician. She thought about how close she'd come to filing that thought away as final. People were almost always more than one thing. That was the part that never got easier. "Where is he?" she said. "Still in the building," Decker said from the door. "On the ER floor." She stood up. "Dana?" Still's voice stopped her. "You don't need to be the one to—" "He's my department," she said. "I'm going down there." She didn't go alone. Decker came with her, and one of his people, and they took the elevator back down to the ground floor, and she walked through the north corridor into the ER with the same measured stride she'd used all night, not faster, not carrying anything in her posture that would arrive in the room before she did. Aldrin was at the nursing station. He was doing what she'd asked him to do, documenting, working through the chart records, his head down, the white coat still on. Lorraine was at the other end of the station, running reassessments, and Petra was visible through the door of Bay 3 with a patient. The ER was beginning to look like itself again, imperfectly, with the scattered aftermath of the night still evident, but functional. Aldrin looked up when she came in. He registered Decker and the agent behind her, and his expression went through several stages, each arriving faster than the last. "Dr. Aldrin," Dana said, "I need you to step away from the workstation." He looked at the 2 federal agents. He looked at the workstation. He looked at Dana. And she watched, in real time, the decision he made. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind that announces itself. A small one. His hand moved toward the keyboard. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Whatever you're thinking of deleting," she said, "has been backed up. Everything on that network, everything routed through this terminal in the last 14 months, is already in federal custody. The only thing you'll accomplish is adding destruction of evidence to what's already there." His hand stayed near the keyboard. Not on it, not moving away. "Marcus." She used his first name for the first time since she'd started at this hospital, and she watched it land, the unexpectedness of it, the intimacy of it, which in this context wasn't warmth, but weight. "You have been treating patients in this ER for 11 years. Some of them correctly. The work matters. What you did with the network doesn't unmake the work, but it doesn't cancel what you did either." He looked at her. She had expected calculation. She'd been reading calculation on his face all night. What she saw instead was something she hadn't planned for. Something exhausted and old. "You were always going to be a problem," he said. Not with anger, with the flat quality of a true statement. "Probably," she said. "I didn't know what you were. I just knew you were. More than you should be. For a nurse in a department like this." He stopped. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Decker moved past her and took a position beside Aldrin, and the agent took the other side, and Aldrin stood between them with his hands coming away from the keyboard slowly, not resisting, just moving in the way of someone whose body understands what's happening before the mind has fully conceded. Lorraine had stopped working. She was watching from the other end of the station, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone reconstructing a picture they thought they knew. "Lorraine," Dana said, "the patients in bays 1 through 4 need their afternoon meds reassessed. Can you take that?" Lorraine looked at her for one more second, then, "Yes." She went. Aldrin was walked out of the ER, not roughly, not with spectacle. Decker was too professional for spectacle. Just walked out. The white coat went with him. The nursing station was quiet for a moment after the sound of footsteps faded. Petra appeared in the doorway of Bay 3. She'd seen enough to understand something significant had happened and not enough to know what. She looked at Dana with the look of someone waiting for context. "Your patient in 3, Dana said. "Where are we on his pain management?" Petra blinked. Then she pulled the chart. "He's overdue for his 2 o'clock dose. I was going to..." "Go ahead." Petra went. Dana sat down at the nursing station, pulled up the system, and started working through the backlog. There was a lot of it. The night had created an administrative disaster on top of everything else. Documentation gaps, medication administration records that needed updating, 3 patients who hadn't had proper reassessments since before 11 o'clock. She started at the beginning of the list and moved through it. She was on the 4th chart when her phone buzzed. Not her personal phone. The secondary line that she had not used in 3 years and had nearly convinced herself was just an old habit she was maintaining for no reason. The message was 4 words. "Heart is in surgery." She stared at it, set the phone down, picked it up again and read it a second time. Not because she'd missed anything, but because her brain wanted to run it twice. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and went back to the chart. Os. Stills came to find her at 3 in the morning. The ER had settled into the particular quiet of a department running below capacity. Unusual. A gift from the circumstances, the kind of empty that the day staff would find unexplained when they came in at 7. Dana had been working for the last 2 hours with Lorraine and Petra, and they had reached the end of the immediate backlog, and she was on her 3rd coffee of the night, which was 2 more than she should have had, given what her nervous system had already been through. Stills came in alone, no staff, just a man in a tired suit who had been up as long as she had. He sat down in one of the waiting area chairs rather than approaching the nursing station, which she read as deliberate, coming to her ground rather than asking her to his. She came and sat in the chair across from him and held her coffee with both hands, because the temperature in the ER had dropped 2 degrees in the last hour, and she could feel it. "He's in custody," Stills said. "The individual responsible for the operational compromises. Taken into custody approximately 40 minutes ago at his home address." She nodded. "It'll be public within 24 hours, possibly less. When it goes public, some of what comes out will reference the operations. Not by name, but by category." He paused. "Your name won't be in anything public. Your current identity will remain. It will remain what you've built it to be." "Unless I choose otherwise," she said. He looked at her. "Unless you choose otherwise." She drank her coffee. Outside, through the ER's exterior windows, the parking lot was clearing, the last of the tactical vehicles pulling out, leaving behind the regular fluorescent quality of a hospital parking structure at 3 in the morning. "The division wants to offer you a reintegration pathway," Stills said. "Full reinstatement, active status. Given what we know now about the extraction, your operational record would be..." "No," she said. He stopped. "I'm not going back," she said. "That's not what this is." "Donna E., I chose this," she said. "Not because I was hiding. I wasn't hiding. I chose this because it was..." She stopped. She almost never started sentences she couldn't finish. "Because it was the right work. Whatever I was doing before, this is the right work. The patients in this building tonight needed someone who could do what I did. That's not nothing." Stills was quiet for a moment. "You could do more. In a reinstated capacity, the reach isn't the point." She looked at him. "The work is the point. The reach is what you're offering because it's the only currency you have left and you know it." She set her coffee down. "I'm not angry at you, Warren. I was, for a long time. But I'm tired right now, and I want to be honest rather than angry. So, this is where I'm going to stay. If that changes, I'll reach out." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. "The division will be in touch about the formal statement," he said. "The public record will reflect the truth about the extraction failure. Posthumous clearance won't apply since you're demonstrably alive, but the operational mischaracterization..." "I don't need clearance," she said. "I need whoever was leaking operations confirmed in custody and the charges to stick. Both of those are in hand. Then we're done for tonight." He stood. She stood. They looked at each other across the waiting area chairs, 2 people who had been in rooms like this before, though never in this configuration. You're good at this, he said. The nursing. I know, she said. He left. Dana stood in the waiting area for a moment after he was gone. She was very tired. Her feet hurt in the specific way that comes from 11 hours of hard floor surfaces, and her left shoulder had developed an ache sometime around midnight that she was choosing not to examine too closely. She had coffee left. She finished it. She went back to the nursing station. Lorraine was there, charting, the efficient silence of someone who has been doing this long enough not to need commentary. She looked up when Dana sat down. Your last patient update came back, Lorraine said. Gerald Poole, from the week Aldrin pulled you off Bay 7. Dana looked at her. He sent a card, Lorraine said. To the nursing staff, generally. It came through 2 days ago, but I had it on the pile. She slid a standard issue Get Well card across the station's surface. It was open. Inside, in unsteady ballpoint, it read, To the nurse who asked about my arm. I don't know your name, but you saved my life. I hope you know that. Dana looked at it for a moment. Then she set it face down on the station and went back to the chart she'd been working. That was where Petra found her 40 minutes later, running documentation updates on the overnight census. When Petra came in from the supply run and set down a printout on the nursing station counter without saying anything. Dana looked at it. It was from the hospital's administrative system, specifically from the network security division that Decker's people had been working through since midnight. It was a routing log, a documentation of every communication that had passed through the compromised administrative terminal in the last 14 months. At the bottom, highlighted in yellow by whoever had prepared the document for her, a specific entry dated 4 days after Dana's first shift at Hartwell General. The entry showed an outbound message from the administrative terminal. She read the routing address, which told her nothing she could decode. She read the metadata. She read the timestamp. And then she read the message flag in the subject line. Not the content, just the 3-character administrative tag that appeared on flagged outbound communications. The tag was OSP7, Osprey 7. He had flagged her arrival, the first week she was here. He had known or suspected, and he had sent a communication about her existence in this building to whoever was on the other end of that terminal. And for 14 months she had been working in a department where the man who ran it had been reporting on her to the people who had tried to have her killed. For 14 months, she had been safe, only because they hadn't decided yet what to do about her. She read the document again. Not because the meaning changed, it didn't. She set it down on the nursing station's surface. The ER hummed around her, the ventilation, the monitors, the distant sound of Petra's footsteps in the corridor. Somewhere outside, a car started in the parking lot. The backup lighting had finally been replaced by the normal overhead fluorescence, white and clean and indifferent, the same light that the morning shift would arrive to find tomorrow as though none of this had happened. Dana Marsh sat at the nursing station with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the document and understood with a clarity that didn't require any additional information that the last 3 years had not been the quiet retirement she'd constructed them to be. She had been walking a wire without knowing the wire was there, and now she knew. And the only question that mattered now, was what she was going to do with that knowledge, and whether the answer she gave would be the answer she could live with, or the answer that the person she used to be would have given without hesitation. She sat very still. And then Decker appeared in the ER doorway, and his face had the quality of someone who has just received information that changes the shape of the problem. Renner, he said, we have him. She looked up. He's asking to speak to the nurse, Decker said. Specifically. Won't talk to anyone else, says he has information about what Stills didn't tell you. Dana looked at Decker for a long moment. Then she stood up. She didn't ask Decker how they'd gotten Renner. She asked where he was. Mobile Command Unit, North Parking Lot. He walked out of the maintenance tunnel into a containment perimeter 20 minutes ago. Didn't resist. Decker paused. He had a drive on him. Physical drive, not networked. Handed it over voluntarily. She looked at him. He planned to get caught. That's our read. She thought about the way Renner had looked at her across the ER floor. The expression she'd spent all night trying to categorize and couldn't quite land on. It wasn't what men who planned to disappear looked like. It was what men who'd run out of other options looked like. Let's go, she said. She paused. The mobile command unit was a converted vehicle parked at the edge of the north lot. All the external markers of official federal operation without any of the advertising. Inside it smelled like stale air and equipment heat, and the particular tension of people who'd been awake for too long, managing something that kept expanding. Renner was seated at the far end, wrists zip-tied in front, a gesture toward restraint rather than genuine containment. She could see from the way he held his hands that he'd made no attempt at the knots. He looked up when she came in. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Just the nurse," he said. Decker looked at Dana. She looked back at him, and he stepped outside and pulled the door half shut. She sat down across from Renner. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She had the impression of two people who had already had the most important version of their conversation and were now arriving at the part where the words got said out loud. "The drive?" she said. "Has everything Hart's package didn't have," Renner said. "Hart was carrying operational documentation. What happened? When? To whom? I was carrying the why." He shifted in his seat. "Who built the arrangement with Aldrin? How the communication network was constructed? The individuals inside the division who signed off on your extraction failure and why it was preferable to letting you come home." She kept her face where it needed to be. "How did you get it?" "Because I was inside it for 8 months before I decided I was done." He looked at her steadily. "We weren't hired to come into that hospital tonight and recover documentation. We were hired to make sure Hart didn't leave it." He paused. "I didn't know about you when I took the contract. I knew we were going into a hospital. I knew there was a target. I knew the client was moving to close a leak. I didn't know the nurse." "But you found out." "I found out 3 days ago when the pre-op package came through and your photograph was in it." He held her gaze. "Not Dana Marsh's photograph, the other one." The air in the vehicle was very still. "They know you're alive," he said. "The people Stills arrested tonight, that's one arm of it. The client who hired us is another arm. They've known for about 4 months. Someone ran a biometric cross-reference through hospital administrative records, routine insurance processing, of all things, and it flagged." He paused. "Aldrin didn't know what he'd found when he flagged your arrival. By month 3, the client knew exactly what he'd found." She thought about the paper on the nursing station, the routing log, the OSP-7 flag on her first week, 14 months of being in a building where someone had known her name. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I took a contract to come into that building and make sure you and Hart didn't walk out, and I didn't execute it." He looked at his hands. "I've done a lot of things in my life I can't reconstruct into something better than they were. This one I can." His jaw worked for a moment. "The drive has everything: names, dates, the financial architecture, the communication chain. It's complete. It's enough to finish this." She sat with that for a moment. Then, "Why not give it to Decker directly?" "Because I wanted you to know it existed from me, before it got processed and filed and became a federal document that nobody explains to you." He looked at her. "You deserve to hear it from the person who was supposed to be on the other side of it." It wasn't an apology. She appreciated that. Apologies in this context would have been an insult to both of them. It was something more precise, an acknowledgement, a handing over, a decision made by a person who had looked at the thing they were about to do and decided the cost was too high. People were almost always more than one thing. She kept arriving at that truth, and she had still never found a way to make it simple. "The client," she said, "the one who hired you. On the drive. Is he in custody?" "Not yet." A pause. "He will be. When Decker's team processes what's on there, they'll have enough. 48 hours, maybe less." She nodded once. She stood up. "Marsh?" He said her name, not the operational one, the current one, the one she'd chosen, with the care of someone who understood the distinction. "For what it's worth, what you did in there tonight. Most people in that building didn't know what you were doing or why. I did." He paused. "It was worth watching." She looked at him one more time. Whatever she'd been carrying about him, the shape of a man who'd walked into a room full of sick people with a weapon, it didn't resolve cleanly. It wasn't supposed to. He'd done something wrong and then done something right. And both of those things were true at the same time and would remain true regardless of what happened next. "Tell Decker everything," she said. "Don't make them work for it." "I know," he said. She left. Bops. The sun came up at 6:42. Dana was on the ER floor when it happened, which meant she knew it not from seeing it, but from the quality of light that began coming through the exterior windows. That specific shift from the flat artificial brightness of the overnight to the first gray-pink infiltration of actual morning. She had been awake for 23 hours. She had not eaten anything since the granola bar at 1 in the afternoon the day before, which her body had been communicating to her with increasing urgency for the last several hours. She finished the medication reconciliation she was on, handed off the census board to the incoming charge nurse, a man named Ben who was exactly 7 minutes late, and apologized for it without knowing what kind of night he was apologizing into, and then stood in the middle of the ER floor for a moment with no immediate task in front of her. It was a strange feeling. She wasn't accustomed to the absence of the next thing. Lorraine found her there. She had her bag on her shoulder and her coat over her arm and the look of a woman who had survived the shift and intended to acknowledge that fact privately and without ceremony. "Go home," Lorraine said. "I'm going." "Donna?" Lorraine stopped. She looked at her with the full attention of a person who has been revising their understanding of someone all night and has arrived finally at a version they can hold. "I've been a nurse for 22 years. I have worked with a lot of people." She paused. "I should have asked earlier what was happening to you in this department. The reassignments, the—" "You documented what you could," Dana said. "That mattered." "It wasn't enough." "No," Dana agreed. "But it was something. That's usually how it works." Lorraine looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded, once, with the precision of a woman making a decision rather than performing an emotion. "See you Thursday," she said, and left. Dana got her bag from the locker room. She changed back into her street clothes, jeans and a gray shirt that she'd put on what felt like another week ago. She stood in front of the locker room mirror and looked at herself for a moment, which she didn't usually do. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been awake for a day and had spent that day doing things she couldn't fully explain to most of the people in her life. She looked ordinary, and she looked, if you knew what to look for, like someone who had stopped trying quite so hard to look only ordinary. She was not the same as she'd been at 6:50 yesterday morning. She wasn't sure yet what the difference was or what it cost, but she could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. She picked up her bag and went home. The public record broke 41 hours later. She was off shift and sitting in her apartment, a spare, clean space that she had furnished with the careful minimalism of someone who had once learned not to accumulate things that couldn't be moved quickly, and who had kept the habit even after the reason for it stopped being urgent, when the news notification came through on her phone. She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the table and looked at the wall. The headline named 3 individuals: a division director within a federal intelligence apparatus, not Stills, someone above Stills, a name she had never heard publicly but recognized from briefings she wasn't supposed to remember. An attorney who had spent 11 years structuring financial arrangements that made certain operational decisions look like administrative accidents. And a man whose name she had seen on exactly one document in her life, at the bottom of the authorization that had sent her into the field on the operation that ended with her reported death. All 3 were identified as having been taken into federal custody. The charges were extensive. The article used words like conspiracy and obstruction and fraudulent alteration of government records. The language of federal prosecution, which was always more mundane than what it described. Below those words, if you knew how to read the shape of an indictment, were the outlines of 3 people who had decided that some lives were administrative problems to be resolved rather than lives, and who had spent years constructing the architecture to act on that decision. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She had anticipated something cleanly satisfying, the arrival of a justice she'd been owed for 3 years. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. Not disappointment, not relief exactly. Something that was closer to the feeling of finishing a very long piece of work and finding that the ending, when it came, was simply the ending. The work had happened. The ending confirmed it. That was all. She picked her phone back up and sent a 3-word message to the secondary line. Saw the news. The response came back in under a minute. Charges will stick. Full operational mischaracterization corrected in the classified record. Your name is clean. She read it. Put the phone down again. Her name had been clean. It had been clean the whole time. That was the thing that nobody who built these situations ever fully reckoned with, that the act of declaring someone a problem didn't make them one, that writing deceased next to a person's operational file didn't undo what the person had done or who they were. She had spent 3 years building a life in a mid-sized city in Kentucky, caring for strangers in a department that didn't respect her. And none of that had been less real or less right because of what was in a file somewhere that she'd never seen. That was the part she'd always known. It just sat differently now that someone else knew it too. But Callum Hart came to find her 6 weeks later. She was on shift, mid-afternoon, a Wednesday. The particular steady-state busyness of a weekday ER that was running at capacity but not above it. She saw him from across the nursing station, tall, the scar still visible, moving with the careful gait of someone whose abdominal surgery was recent enough that the body was still negotiating with itself about what it could do. He was in civilian clothes. He was alone. She finished the medication order she was entering before she went to him, which he waited for without impatience, leaning against the wall near the entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets. "You look better," she said when she reached him. "I feel approximately 60%, he said, "which is up from 20, so—" "Sit down before you fall down," she said, and pointed at the nearest chair. He sat. She sat across from him, and they were quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when there's too much to say, and they're both deciding where to start. "I wanted to come sooner," he said. "They kept me in a facility until about 2 weeks ago. Debrief, recovery, the usual sequence." "I know. Decker told me you were out." He nodded. "The operation's closed. Everything we were carrying, Renner's drive, the documentation package, it completed the case. The prosecution's moving forward. The 3 individuals, I saw the news." "Right." He looked at her. "What about Aldrin?" "Formally charged 8 days ago. Accessory to conspiracy, obstruction of federal investigation, misuse of institutional network access." She paused. "His medical license was suspended pending resolution of the criminal case. The hospital's cooperating fully with the investigation. New administrative structure, new department oversight." A beat. "It's not fixed. Nothing is fixed in 8 days, but it's moving." Callum nodded slowly. He was looking at her with the focused attention she recognized from the gurney, the quality of someone who has done their own assessment and is now checking it against the source. "Stills said you turned down reintegration," he said. "Stills talks a lot." He said it like he respected it. He paused. "Do you regret it?" She thought about this. She'd been thinking about it for 6 weeks, in the spaces between patients, between shifts, in the apartment in the quiet hours when honest questions were harder to avoid. She'd thought about what she'd walked away from, and what she'd walked toward, and whether the calculation still held now that the circumstances had changed. "No," she said, "not the way you mean." "What way do I mean?" "You mean, do I wish I'd gone back to the field, done the larger work, the wider reach?" She looked at him. "The answer to that is no." She paused. "There are things I miss about it. The clarity, mostly. In the field there's a mission and you execute it and the lines are usually clear. Here," she gestured at the ER around them, "the lines are never clear. You're doing 100 things at once and half of them are incomplete, and you're making judgment calls with incomplete information on 4 hours of sleep, and someone's life is in the balance, and you still might get it wrong." She paused. "But the work is right. That's different from the lines being clear." He looked at her for a long moment. "You knew what you were doing that night, all of it. You made decisions most trained operators wouldn't have made the same way." "I made some calls that worked," she said. "And I made some calls because I was tired and improvising, and they happened to work. Don't construct a perfect picture out of it." He almost smiled again. Like before, it almost made it all the way. "You always talk about yourself like that? Like you're trying to keep someone from being too impressed?" "I talk about myself like what happened happened, and the parts that went wrong also happened, and both are true." She looked at him. "How are you, Callum? Not medically." He was quiet for a moment. The question had landed differently than she'd intended, or maybe exactly as she'd intended. He looked at the ER floor and then back at her. I've been doing this for 12 years, he said. The carrying and the running and the packages that can't be transmitted and the hospitals you end up in when it goes wrong. He paused. This one went wrong in a way I didn't plan for. The part where you survived it. The part where someone I didn't know stood between four armed men and a room full of patients and managed the whole thing like it was Tuesday. He held her gaze. That doesn't happen. In my experience, that doesn't happen. It happened because there were 43 people in that building who needed it to happen, she said. That's the whole explanation. He looked at her. She looked back at him. There was something in the air between them that wasn't unspoken. It was spoken. They were speaking it, just in the register that doesn't require words. The one two people find when they have been through something together that most people never go through at all. I'm going to be in Corbin Falls for a few more weeks, he said. Follow-up appointments, debriefs. A pause. Maybe coffee. If you have an hour sometime that isn't the middle of a crisis. I have hours, she said. They're just irregular. I can work with irregular, he said. She stood up. So did he, carefully, with the consciousness of his stitches. Same number on the secondary line? He asked. Same number, she said. Sit back down. You just had abdominal surgery 6 weeks ago. He sat back down and she went back to work, and behind her she heard him exhale a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. 3 months later, Hartwell General quietly announced 2 institutional changes. The first was a revision to the ER's clinical escalation policy, which now formally required that any nursing staff concern flagged about a patient's status had to be documented and reviewed within a 2-hour window and could not be dismissed without a countersigning physician review. It was 6 pages of policy language that translated, in practice, to one thing. Nurses' warnings would be taken seriously, on the record, with consequences for ignoring them. The second was the appointment of a new ER medical director. The search committee had interviewed 11 candidates. They had chosen a woman from a trauma program in Ohio who, in her interview, had said that the thing she looked for most in a department was whether the nurses trusted the physicians, because in her experience, the nurses were always the first to know when something was wrong. Dana read both announcements on the break room bulletin board on a Thursday afternoon. She read them once, standing up, with her lunch still in her hand, and then she went back to her patients. Petra found her in Bay 6 10 minutes later. Petra was 6 months further out of school than she'd been the night of the standoff, and she carried herself differently. Not confidently in the performed sense, but in the settled sense, the way you carry yourself when you've been tested and found something you can rely on. Did you see the policy update? Petra said. Yes. They're naming it the Clinical Escalation Protocol. A pause. It's basically everything you've been doing since you got here. Dana changed the IV bag she'd come to change. It's what everyone should have been doing. Now they'll have to. Petra was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? You're going to anyway. Did you know it was going to be okay? Did you have some kind of, I don't know how to ask this. Dana looked at her. No, she said. I didn't know. I made decisions based on what I could see and what I knew, and some of them worked, and some of them could have gone the other way. She paused. That's not a dramatic answer. It's a true one, Petra said. Usually those are the same. She finished with the IV. Your patient in 4 needs a reassessment in 20 minutes. Don't let the board tell you it's 30. The charting is off by 10. Petra went. Dana moved to the next thing. That was the rhythm. It had always been the rhythm. The next patient, the next decision, the incomplete information and the judgment call, and the thing that went sideways, and the thing that, against the odds, and through effort, and through the specific refusal to stop trying even when every signal said you should, went right. She had been dismissed and sidelined and documented as dead and worked in a department that didn't see her and stood between 4 armed men and 43 patients who didn't know she was doing it. And she had done all of it in blue scrubs with a coffee stain on the left sleeve, and none of it had required anyone's recognition to be real. The recognition had come anyway. That was its own kind of justice. Not the dramatic public vindication she'd never needed, but the quiet, undeniable accumulation of things that happened and people who saw them, and a record that now said what it was supposed to say. She had learned, in the years between the field and the ER, that the most important work usually looks like nothing from the outside. It looks like a woman in a hallway checking a blood pressure, asking a question nobody else thought to ask, standing in a difficult place and staying there. It looks like Tuesday. It looks ordinary right up until the moment it turns out to have been the thing that mattered most. She had chosen this. She would choose it again. The ER board updated. A new patient came through the north entrance, triaged and checked in, added to the queue. Dana looked at the board, looked at the patient, and crossed the floor to meet them. The work was the point. The work had always been the point. She went back to it.